Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Pharmaceutical Commercial Launch Readiness, Secrets to De-risk and Accelerate Success. My name is Ryan Muse, and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speaker. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved, so please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Pharmaceutical Consulting, who developed the content for this presentation. Pharmaceutical Consulting specializes in pharmaceutical and biotech commercialization, helping clients with strategy through execution in 5 core service areas of new product planning, marketing, launch readiness, medical affairs, and market access. Pharmaceutical Consulting offers integrative, tailored consulting services to meet their brand and business needs. Their diverse team brings experience from over 70 product launches, strategy and innovation leadership, and executional support for startup to large pharma clients. They have experience across a wide variety of therapeutic areas, including oncology, rare disease, metabolic disease, CNS, women's health, and others. And so now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Beth Sherman has helped to grow Pharmaceutical Consulting during the last 12 years into a world-class firm helping clients with commercial strategy, innovation, and execution. She has been involved in new product commercialization and brand optimization across oncology, CNS, metabolic disease, dermatology, women's and men's health, from rare disease to blockbuster brands. Prior to joining Pharmaceutical Consulting, Sherman worked on the client side in marketing roles at Bristol Myers Squibb and Novo Nordisk. David Reese's market access expertise is built on 25+ years of experience assisting clients in developing strategies to optimize brand access in the competitive biopharmaceutical market. David's creativity, strategic acumen, deep market insight, and client focus has earned him an industry-wide reputation amongst market access professionals. Prior to joining Pharmaceutical Consulting, David co-founded Health Strategies Group and was instrumental in building its industry-leading reputation for strategic insight in the rapidly evolving U.S. access landscape. And so now, without further ado, I would like to hand the mic over to our first speaker. Beth, you may begin when ready.
Wonderful. Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate everyone's time today. I know that we all have busy schedules, but hopefully this hour will be very educational, and we look forward to some interesting discussion in the Q&A as well. We're going to focus in on launch readiness. This is, as mentioned, a real core area of focus for the organization. We do a tremendous amount of launch planning. We'll talk a little bit about who we are in that background, but we'll really dive into the launch phase of product lifecycle, critical success factors, and some recommendations and insights into de-risking and accelerating launch. Pharmaceutical Consulting, in addition to a product launch focus, also supports new product planning, commercial and marketing excellence, medical affairs and market shaping, and market access and strategy. As mentioned, we are really focused in on commercialization in the pharmaceutical and biotech space. We help clients with strategy through execution, and we look forward to providing some insights today. So let's jump into what product lifecycle and where we are in talking about this launch. As products in any industry, they go, you go through a product development, introduction, growth, maturity, and decline phase. Hopefully you manage every element of that to optimize the brand, and it really does start before commercial launch. And as we talk about the commercial launch date, it's really a multi-year preparation to get ready for that, because that initial introduction into the market and the trajectory you set at that point in time is really critical to the brand. We'll talk a little bit about tipping points, but I wanted to jump right in and make sure that we're giving some insights right away, because some of you may not even be able to last the whole hour given calendar conflicts. So let me give some examples. Some of these we've worked on directly, and some are marketplace experiences. We'll talk right now, and again later in the presentation, about some of the tipping points along the way as you're getting ready for commercial launch and success. There's challenge areas in that development and creating a differentiated product. Vumerity is a very recent example of this, which was a Biogen launch as a Tecfidera line extension, which is struggling to gain acceptance in the marketplace. They launched with a focus on tolerability, and it's just challenged to be a bit differentiated enough to grow. Intercept has challenges with regulatory hurdles. This is a group that's trying to establish the NASH marketplace in metabolic diseases, and they've had a number of delays and unexpected regulatory pushback in a recent CRL for a NASH product. And it's a great example of probably being a little bit surprised at the response from the regulatory groups in their delays. We've seen that with a number of clients who maybe minimize the risks on the regulatory side. Preparing the market. This is another area that groups have a challenge in sometimes. These four logo icons here represent the four recent launches in the obesity market, and obesity is a great example of you can't just launch a brand and have the science sell itself, because you really need to establish a disease state and a desire to medically manage obesity as a disease. And that's a huge effort that needed to start well in advance of launching the brand to achieve brand success. Cimzia, the next logo here, is an example of one of the challenge areas in marketing and planning for the market you're targeting. Cimzia is in an immunology space where there are big players with lots of spend. This is a brand by UCB, and you really have to ensure when you're launching into a competitive market space with a lot of spend that you're prepared for your specific niche marketing and for the amount of spend and marketing effort to compete in that marketplace. A couple of the ones on the right-hand side, don't estimate access hurdles. Market access strategy in launching a product in the US in particular and abroad is very critical, because you could have the best product, but if it's not covered by national plans or here by commercial plans as well, you're just not going to have success. Toujeo was a follow-on product in the diabetes market. It's a long-acting insulin that followed Lantus by Sanofi, and you know, it was really intended to take over and change the marketplace to a new brand, probably not enough differentiation to really achieve the kinds of premium brand pricing they might have wanted originally, and a real brand that you had to look at the market access strategy to achieve success. Understanding the market, making sure your insights in preparing for the commercialization are really honed in. Zulresso is a product by Sage Therapeutics, which recently launched, and they essentially have walked away from the commercialization of that product because it was not successful in the market at all. They had a 60-hour injection, and the insights into how it would get prescribed, how it would get utilized and covered just didn't meet market reality, and they could not achieve not only the success they were looking for, but just a stable situation in the marketplace. So again, starting early and really having the nuances of understanding the insights. And then when we talk about execution, we have lots of situations now where brands are launching multiple indications in very quick succession. Keytruda is a great example of that, where you're almost in a continuous launch cycle, and how do you manage that as an organization and have the resources and expertise and success on launch after launch. So we come in and help teams with thinking through the strategy, making sure their insights are well documented and understood, the strategy is built to those insights, and really making sure that the execution of launch is buttoned up tight so that you're meeting all of the tipping points along the way. Launches are increasing, not only things like Keytruda with multiple indications, but just in the marketplace overall, the rate of launches has increased over time and is continuing to do such. So getting launch ready and being able to achieve launch success is a critical skill set for organizations, and will continue to be such. We even see more companies leveraging fast track designation, which means in the US that is increasing the speed by which you have to get ready for launch. So you see here a significant increase in rare disease and even a bit outside of rare disease using fast track designation, which can be, we've seen as quick as 2 to 4 months, more typically 6 months. And what happens in launch when you're using something like an accelerated approval is you have to plan for the earliest possible approval and get your organization ready if it takes a bit longer, because often you don't know exactly when you're going to get it in that case. And that provides additional challenges to launch readiness. There's really increasing pressures all around on launching products. Teams have resource constraints, competition is increasing even in these areas of rare disease and oncology, and there's of course increasing price pressures both here in the US, in the EU markets. The access and price pressures are something that has to be thought of well in the early stages of product commercial go-to-market planning and success and forecast development, and then how do you get it right as you're executing against it. Many do falter at the challenge. If you're interested in this area and you've looked at launch publications in the past, there's been many studies done on tens and dozens of launches to look at what happens with launch, what's the trajectory, and what you see is that it's really easy to kind of falter at the beginning, and if you don't achieve the right trajectory when you're in that first 6 months of launch, it's very hard to recover from that. Only about 34% of assets achieve or exceed their first year forecast. And then what happens is more than 2/3 of launches that lagged forecast in year 1 continue to lag forecasts in year 2 and 3. So really achieving awareness, recognition, desire to prescribe, the ability to utilize the product appropriately at the beginning, and the differentiation for the brand in that first 6 months is very critical for how that brand is going to perform over its life cycle. We took a quick snapshot of a set of launches. We wanted to take something that was far enough back you could see the trajectory. This just demonstrates that principle. It's, for the most part, really hard to change the trajectory. You see here most of the lines kind of continue along a linear regression of where they started. Eliquis is one that was able to change its trajectory pretty significantly. Jakafi is another that you see a bit of an uptick, and we know that they looked at their strategic imperatives and how they were looking at the marketplace and how they were executing against that about a year or two in, and did some changes around that. So if your trajectory isn't in the first year or two where you need it to be, you have to really reevaluate your strategy, your critical insights, what's going wrong with your execution, and how do you change that. And it's very challenging once you've been established and you maybe have increased competitive situation. So few and far between are able to change that launch trajectory and really achieve a different kind of path. I'm going to pause here for a moment and allow for our first poll question.
Yes, so we have a poll question for audience members to interact with in real time. This should be up on your screen right now. You can vote by just clicking on an answer and clicking submit. So the question is, what drives your interest in launch planning? Your answer options are, I'm in industry role and in the middle of planning a launch, or I'm in an industry role and about to start planning a launch. I'm in an industry role and just launched the product. I'm a vendor supporting launches, or I'm just curious. So go ahead and take a moment to answer as appropriate. It looks like the majority of you have already voted, so let's go ahead and take a look at those results. 39% coming in saying you're curious, 24% for both in an industry role and starting to plan, or a vendor supporting launches, and then 12% coming in saying that you are in the middle of planning a launch. So thank you very much for your participation. It's back to you, Beth.
Thank you. I applaud everyone who's really taking a few moments out to gain some additional insights to help them in their current or future planning. We look forward to some of your questions. It's good for us to know where you're coming from. We're going to talk a little bit about, what makes a successful launch. We see a lot of teams, especially new startups, who have an asset they've been working on sometimes for 10 years or more before commercialization, and they're enamored with their great science, which is wonderful, and they can sometimes get a little bit narrow in the thinking that the science will sell itself, and it just really won't. You have to do everything around it correctly. You have to start with solid science that's going to have a differentiated brand, especially with improved efficacy, safety profile. Sometimes dosing can be an advantage that will give you a space in the marketplace. But then you really have to think about the other elements around that. You have to have early and consistent market shaping, and that is really specific to the market. Do you have to establish a market? Do you have to raise awareness of a patient unmet need, or raise awareness around issues that align to what challenge your brand is solving for? Sometimes it can be something that is already a pent-up demand, but oftentimes you have to establish why this product is proving a solution to a problem, and also just highlight the benefits of making change or that new MOA. So that takes time, at least a year or more. Better off, the more the better, and the more reach you can get in market shaping, the better established you are for a fast uptake of your product. Then on the right-hand side, you have to think about your clear strategy and an aligned go-to-market plan. So what's your forecast? Who are the patients and providers that you want to be aware of your brand, use your brand, and how does it align to how they think about their own selection? And when you have created that in your strategic direction, is your organization structured and resourced to meet that? Do you have enough field force? Do you have enough marketing budget? Do you have enough money to do that early market shaping that you may need in a new therapeutic area? So the plan really needs to align to what you're trying to achieve. And I'm going back on the left-hand side, that really does need to take into account the payer and competitive environment as well. Payer strategy and insights are often coming earlier in development, but sometimes not early enough. It can be that your science group, your clinical group, created an asset that was a good development path, but it wasn't really thought about what the payers would, how they would respond to it in development, and you have to create that storyline. You have to create the health economic story right at the time when you're launching. And it's very important to think about where you fit in their environment of patients they have to cover and products they're covering. And you also have to think of the competitive set. And we'll talk in a few minutes about how that can impact what you're able to achieve and not how you can not be blindsided by the competitive environment. We'll also speak to access beyond payers and making sure that you're thinking about all of the stakeholders that influence the ability to get the product covered and received by the patient. And then finally, planning, execution, and tracking. And this is where we often come in because of the expertise of dozens and dozens of launches to really make that very efficient, and how it is planned for in detail, tracked, and really designed to de-risk the process. We'll talk a little bit about each of these now. First, this establishing the market in which to launch. I always find it really very interesting as a marketer to be in a place where you're creating a new therapeutic area, you're creating new thinking, you have an opportunity to launch a new mechanism of action. It's a very exciting space to be in. It all requires early and consistent market shaping. We captured here some of the examples that we've seen a few years ago. Earlier in my career, it was the erectile dysfunction market that was created and met by Pfizer first and has expanded beyond that. Pfizer also launched a smoking cessation marketplace that they're still meeting. Restless leg syndrome is a good example of another therapeutic category that was created when a solution was available. And of course, obesity, where there's really a need for therapeutic options, and there's still a process of establishing obesity as a medical disease and an area to manage medically. What we have found in doing some analog research in all of these is that there's 3 or 4 things that really are a focus area for success in creating a therapeutic marketplace or creating any unmet need in the marketplace. You have to have an efficacious product offering. You can't create some solution, some marketplace need and talk to doctors about it without having an efficacious solution in hand. Some of what the challenge has been in obesity is the level of efficacy that the products to date are offering is not necessarily sufficient to increase demand for medical management. Whereas erectile dysfunction and even the smoking cessation products were better able to meet that need. You have to have enough marketplace spend to physicians and elsewhere to create awareness. And smoking cessation and erectile dysfunctions were among those that not only did awareness occur directly to physicians and directly to patients, but also through areas of Surgeon General in the US and policy relationships where there was an advocacy and policy voice out there to support the marketplace development. We're seeing the beginning of that in obesity as well. So it needs to be a multi-prong approach to creating awareness of the disease state. And that then needs to be supported by coverage, which is not just a national or local payer deciding to cover, but often also a policy change to recognize the disease, and in the US to enable ICD-10 codes to be captured and other coding mechanisms so that it can be identified and reimbursed. So there's this multi-prong approach for establishing the marketplace or expanding a marketplace that brands teams need to think about how they're approaching that, and are they doing sufficient multi-channel approaches in their plan early and in support of the brand as they're launching as well.
I think there's a perception in our client base anyway that you need to be big to be successful, and we would disagree with that. You can be successful really along a continuum of patient population sizes as long as your strategy, your spend, planning, and your forecast all align. This is a list of top launches through 2016 published in Nature, and we added a few notable launches, including Humira, Keytruda, Eliquis, and Epidiolex, which is a small brand for seizure disorders, but it's very successful, even though it's a very niche product. We added this because top 20 lists really target big dollar brands, but you can be successful with smaller niche brands if you know what you're aiming at and you plan accordingly. So I just want to kind of reframe the conversation to emphasize that as long as your plan aligns with your target, you can be successful regardless of the size. One of the key success factors for a successful launch is making sure that you've got realistic payer and competitive assessments. And certainly payer receptivity to new brands is an obvious source of launch risk. And marketers need to ensure early on that the value that they intend to put into the marketplace aligns with what payers consider to be the true competition for the brand. And we advise teams to really focus on 4 key questions early in their development and launch planning. And the first is to ask the question, what do payers consider to be the standard of care for the brand in the target line of therapy? Not in the condition overall, but in the target that they intend to go after. And then how does that perception differ from what prescribers might believe? The next question is, what is the incremental value to stakeholders of improving on the standard of care, and over what time frame can they expect to see that value realized? A good example of a brand that missed this alignment with the real competition is the launch of Repatha in hyperlipidemia. With 10 million undertreated cholesterol patients, Repatha was expected to be a blockbuster. The true competition in this market is high-dose generic statins. And Repatha actually did a great job in their clinical trials, showing that in this population, they succeeded in lowering LDL by about 64% on top of maximally titrated statins. But the price at $14,000 a year far exceeded the payer's expectation of value. Amgen added to the value equation with the Fourier study, which showed a reduction in cardiovascular events, but still at a price of $14,000 that didn't really meet payers' expectations of value. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that they lowered the price to $6,000 a year that the brand started to move and access picked up. But the brand never really recovered, and sales to this day are still hovering around $500 million, which is far from the blockbuster expectations the brand had at launch. An example of a brand that got it right is Janssen's Erleada for prostate cancer. Janssen identified a patient population that the standard of care didn't address well, and that's men with non-metastatic disease who showed signs of progressing prostate cancer. Both payers and prescribers recognized that the standard of care, which is generic androgen suppression, didn't serve this population's needs. By offering a new treatment option for these men at a price competitive with other androgen blockers, branded androgen blockers, Janssen aligned the value of Erleada with payers' expectations of value in the category. And to this day, Erleada has good access and is a well-performing brand. The access risks to launch don't stop with payers, particularly for brands in competitive categories that target small patient populations. Moderate to severe psoriasis is actually a good example here. While the category is fairly large, few patients actually switch treatments over the course of a year. And like in many rare disease areas, a fraction of prescribers account for the majority of prescriptions. So to manage the risk, marketers need to make sure that prescribing and fulfillment are seamless for patients and prescribers, because every patient and every prescriber matters to launch success. So key tactics or strategies like a broad specialty pharmacy network are important, and also making sure that the patient support programs, particularly at the time of first prescription, are robust so that patients experience rapid fulfillment with their new therapy.
Thank you, Dave. We're going to move into some specifics on how to go about launch planning and launch management. Before we do that, we have another poll question.
Yes, we've got a second poll question for everyone to interact with at this moment. The question is, what are the biggest areas of concerns for your launch? Your answer options are access, regulatory approval or label, manufacturing issues, resource constraints and getting everything done, or simply something else. So please take a moment to consider the best answer as it applies to yourself, your company, and your launch. It looks like most of you have voted. You're very good at this. Thank you very much for your participation. Let's go ahead and take a look at the results. 32% saying regulatory approval, 29% coming in for resource constraints, 19% at access, 16% for something else, and then 3% at the end for manufacturing issues. Again, thank you for your participation. It's back to you, Beth.
Thank you, Ryan. Not surprised at the spread. Actually thought I might even see more equal issues around the different question areas. We see organizations that we work with have concerns about risks in all of these places, more and more so in the resource constraints of, how do you meet the challenges of the marketplace? How do you have enough people to get it done? How do you have enough spend to be able to achieve what you're trying to do? And then there are those things that you can't control potentially in the regulatory environment. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. We'll get into some of these specific areas. This is a view of, how you might look at the launch planning process and what timeline it speaks to. I mentioned earlier that it's not just that year before launch. It really happens early. It starts with new product planning as you're thinking about your indication scope and how you're informing your new product planning and stage gate models for assets, because you want to be thinking about what's going to be successful in the marketplace as you're making decisions in the clinical realm. And you're thinking about those regulatory risks from the beginning. What's the environment? What indication could you potentially get? And how does that meet the needs in the marketplace? And then the manufacturing issues start to play into account as you're thinking about, can you manufacture it? What's the cost of goods? Can you meet the demand? Do you have enough lines for it? What's the batch size relative to the size of the market you're trying to fill, and how does that contribute to cost of goods? Are there challenges with the formulation of the product, or what formulations do you want to put in the marketplace? Do you want a pill? Do you want also a liquid? Do you want an IV relative to the mechanism of action? So these things are not always thought of initially as a commercial planning, but they all play into what you're bringing to marketplace and how you have to think about your go-to-market strategy. And then generally about 3 years out as a best practice, you start really thinking about your commercial planning, your go-to-market strategy. What is your marketing going to look like? What's the size of your field force that you need, and therefore what investment do you need to raise? How do you start with scientific communication and planning around publications? How do you develop the right market access strategy and health economics data to support that? And as you get closer to that 2 years or year out, you start getting more detailed in your planning around what your brand campaigns will look like, what your patient services will look like. You start thinking in more detail about the sales organization and other field organizations, and you're building out your commercial infrastructure. And we work with teams from new startups doing their first commercialization through large pharma. And in every case, you also have to be thinking about the commercial infrastructure development. Sometimes for small startups, that means everything from setting up your order to cash and all of the other infrastructure elements and CRM and IT security, and making sure that they're sufficient to meet the needs and they're in place in time. For bigger pharma, that also is infrastructure expansion, because you want to make sure if you're a new therapeutic area, you have enough resources. If you're a brand or a line indication that's using teams that are also supporting other brands or a central function of the organization, do you get enough time and focus from them to achieve what you need? So having a very detailed plan to ensure that you are thinking through all the organization needs and having them available in time is really critical. We wanted to just share a few specific examples, make this a little bit interesting and not just their theory. With the right experience, the success trajectory can also be really quick. I talked about the best practice being 3 years out to start to plan, but our most recent was a co-promote that was established 3 months pre-PDUFA, pre-approval, with limited commercial readiness planning or market shaping completed to date. So this is a really fast turnaround to design the plan, align all the decisions to make sure there's no delays across a co-promotion, really maintaining focus on critical activities, and how do you launch and start the market shaping basically at the same time. So as with everything, really having a strategy defined and communicated around the organization and aligned messaging and sharing that, but getting that to that decision of how you articulate it very quickly, and doing that across organizational alignment with the alliance partners, developing a prioritized launch activity plan, and defining what things aren't going to be done for launch and are going to be done post-launch is a real success factor in achieving a very fast launch. And then making sure you have a defined governance and RACI, that responsible, aware, and sorry, I'm forgetting all the RACI acronyms aspects at the moment. You know, defining who's responsible for what and who's just informed, accountable, thank you. And establishing an efficient tracking process. Whether you're trying to get this done in 3 months or 2 years, you need a plan that you can check against, that you can know when things are delayed, that you can see your risk areas. So having a partner or someone in your organization who is really that project owner and coordinating across the functions and owning that plan and tracking is very critical to ensuring that you know where you are as an organization in the launch process. So what's the secret to successful planning? Whether you are new to market, whatever kind of product you're putting out there in the pharmaceutical space, there's some key success factors in planning a launch. Maybe this is the meat of what folks have been looking for, but as you think about successful commercial readiness planning elements, It's ensuring you have objective insight, that you are looking at your asset and the marketplace needs with an objective lens, and designing your strategy for the brand that will meet commercial opportunity areas and have demand for your product, and that you articulate that in a way that helps the organization then tactically plan and execute against it. And it has to be differentiated enough. We'll show you in a minute, key pillars that are true for every brand, but really the benefit of having experienced marketing individuals looking at developing your strategy is articulating something that is clear to drive differentiation in your marketplace. Everyone needs to develop your brand, but what's really going to differentiate you, and how does your plan align to that? Then you need that comprehensive and integrated plan. We've seen many organizations try and let each silo do their thing and just get to it, and it often results in misalignment or things that are missed, or risks that come up and have to be scrambled to be dealt with because you didn't identify them fast enough and early enough, or you didn't identify the interdependencies. So really a comprehensive and integrated plan. Risk identification, mitigation. This is something that is best done with a group that really has gone through it before. We have a lot of teams that we see where individuals may have seen one piece of a launch, or they may have done marketing in other areas but never been involved in a launch. And it can be really challenging for individuals in those situations to identify things that will become a risk and plan for their mitigation early enough. And what an experienced partner or group that has done launch many times can bring to the table is the right questions, the right insight to help identify risks across the organization, risks that would limit your ability to launch on time or achieve all your strategic objectives. And then I've talked about it already, tracking and measurement, making sure that you have a structure by which you can look at where you are and have transparency in the organization as to the status of all the things that are supposed to be getting done, and an organizational culture that allows for it not to always be green. Those partners that we work with, the client teams that show their dashboard across all the functional teams, and every time you ask, everything's green, is just unrealistic. And you have to have a culture that enables you to really look at the challenge areas and why, you might maybe you need one more body to just get everything done. Maybe you need a different kind of external partner for certain things to have the expertise to achieve the goals. So whatever it may be, to ensure that the organization has a culture that they can raise their hand and say, we're not quite going to achieve the level of success or timeline without X. And then lastly, and this is incredibly important, is effective decision making. The ability of organizations to take information in and have a governance model that enables decision making in a timely manner is incredibly important for success in a commercial launch. And it can be really challenging. You can often go around and around for weeks or months, and it feels like you're having important conversations, but if you're not making decisions at a critical moment in time, it can delay launch or impact the strategic direction of the brand.
Go ahead.
The speed of competitive entrance can significantly influence what happens in the marketplace. There's some really good examples recently of, you see the hepatitis C market, for example, where it was a lot of pent-up demand that resulted in Gilead having great success initially, and then once the patient demand was met and there was not as many patients waiting for that kind of treatment for hepatitis, the market overall shrank, and then as new entrants entered, the pricing pressure began. So not surprising in the Hep C market, but important for those second and third entry brands to be realistic about their forecast planning and their aligned go-to-market strategy and spend if they're going to be in a very competitive situation with price pressures. We talked about the integrated commercial plan. I'll just spend a minute here. These 6 imperatives on the left are representative of what most brands need to think about in terms of strategic direction for getting ready for commercialization. As I said, it's very important to take these kind of basic pillars and really ensure that you have a differentiated, very specific delineation of this and articulation of this for your brand and your marketplace. And then you need a plan that looks at how each of the different functional areas are contributing to each of those strategic imperatives. And you wind up with a very cross-functional integrated plan where there's handoffs and there's joint decision making, and ensuring that that's planned for, documented, and moving forward in a really integrated way is critical to achieve success. There's often unaddressed risks that can delay or diminish launch. I kicked off our talking through some specific examples, but I just wanted to highlight for those of you looking at how do you think about your launch planning, that you need to have a plan and a process in place where you can identify risks around the functional areas. You do that throughout the process of getting ready for launch, and you're continuously reevaluating that because they can come up in regulatory, manufacturing, supply chain. There's new risks right now with API coming out of China that was delayed because of COVID, with teams in supply chain who have single source manufacturing, and they're thinking now about, wow, maybe I need to rethink that, and then that impacts the regulatory submission. So things happen that you need to address. Market development, marketing right now, always a challenge area. There's always risks when things like COVID happen and the environment completely changes. You need the ability to understand the marketplace and the challenges that poses, and have scenario plans and an agile organization to address that. Market access, you can plan years in advance, but it does change. Maybe a new entrant surprised you in their timeline, and therefore the access challenges in the environment have changed, and you need to look at what your competitive advantage is. So there's risks there. There's also risks about getting access to the key players, whether you're in Europe and trying to get to the national players, or here in the US trying to get to the national and regional players. You have to, as an organization, be able to get them to the table and have a robust conversation around the marketplace need and your asset, and that can be challenging as well. So there's some standard things, and then there's some things that each organization is going to face along the way, and having a team that can really identify those and act on them is really critical. We're getting to our last section. We have one more poll question.
Yes, and this poll question asks, where do you think your product's biggest launch risks lie? Your answer options are manufacturing, regulatory approval, market access, marketing, or infrastructure. This is our last poll for this presentation, and it just simply would like to know, where do you think your product's biggest launch risks lie? Take a moment to consider your answer, select the one that's most appropriate, and then click Submit at the bottom. We do thank you very much for your participation in these. It's some wonderful insight. It looks like most of you have voted, so we'll go ahead and take a look at the results now. 38% coming in for market access, then 23% for regulatory approval, 19% at marketing, 12% at infrastructure, and then 8% trailing at market or manufacturing. Thank you very much for your participation. It is, of course, back to you, Beth.
Thank you, Ryan. Dave, I'll open it up for some of our discussion as we think about those that are looking at market access risks.
Sure.
Any insights you want to share about planning for risks and market access?
Sure. Well, I think the big risk is to make sure that you've thought about what that incremental value is that you're offering to payers, and making sure that you've articulated that effectively. And that obviously happens very early in your product planning. But one of the risks that we see as products get closer to launch is that engagement with payers over time to refine and augment how you're displaying, how you're communicating that value doesn't happen. And so I think that what we would really recommend for clients is to make sure that during their pre-approval information exchange meetings, that there's a feedback loop into marketing, into the access team, to make sure that you're refining that articulation of value as you get closer to launch.
Great, Dave. I want to just mention the next page we're talking about with dashboarding. we talk about it in terms of dashboarding Goldilocks, because there's a level of too much and too little in dashboarding. There's a need to look at dashboarding. We talk about leading and lagging indicators, and I'll describe what that is. But you also need to think about making sure you're not overwhelming your organization with too much time spending looking at your measurement. And you also need to have a level of dashboarding that is sufficient that people will look at it. We have teams who put out 40-page dashboards, and it's so much information, and it's not defined in a way that everyone can really digest it. So we have to make sure that you think about what's the right size for your organization, for your marketplace. You want dashboarding that will help you make decisions and move things forward. You want to dashboard your internal activities and what's going on, and we talked about getting launch ready. And you also want to dashboard it even before launch, your engagement leading indicators. Are you getting appointments with your customers in advance of launch to talk about the marketplace need? And then there are lagging indicators, which is, are you achieving your reach and frequency? Are you getting information requests that are in line with what you thought would be the question areas? Are you achieving click-throughs on your digital efforts? So those are the kind of lagging indicators. And there are access lagging indicators as well, in terms of where you're getting access, where your formulary is at the tier you're looking for, what level of prior authorization you might achieve, be facing, and is it in line with what you were expecting? And all of these things lead to ultimately your script volume, which is what you're aiming for. But ensuring that your organization has the right level of dashboarding to help you with informed decision making. There's a launch planning process. We do a lot of this where we go in, we help organizations make sure that they're learning, that they're really documenting their insights about themselves and the marketplace. They're building, with our help, the detailed launch plan cross-functionally that's very structurally aligned. So it's not only completely covering all of the things that need to be done, but then viewed in a way that is digestible. So you want to make sure you have that launch plan in a structure that the teams can be looking at. Are we doing things in the right time? Do we have everything we thought about? How are our interdependencies aligned? And so that launch build and a comprehensive build to address all the risk areas. We make sure that our teams have a really structured governance model for evaluating and deciding on key things with regard to launch, and also that they are sharing information cross-functionally to ensure that each of the functional areas are able to do their roles sufficiently based on the knowledge that the whole team has. And then a structured dashboarding that's right-sized for the organization. So last couple of slides, achieving a forecast trajectory is more than just the right go-to-market. It's about having a really defined strategy that's clear and transparent. It's about having a detailed plan in place that the organization can use as a whole. It's certainly about resourcing appropriately with adequate dollar and people resource teams to achieve that plan. Risk management, and this is really how do you know what questions to ask to identify the risks and act on them and make a mitigation plan if you haven't seen those before. And then that fully aligned and integrated organization. So we think about all of these 5 pillars as we're working with teams in commercial planning at the start and throughout the process. So we think that a partner is really valuable because we bring the expertise to develop that comprehensive plan to help you de-risk the situation, because we have seen virtually every kind of risk in across functional roles, and we can help you to identify them, to plan for them, and to address them both at the beginning of a commercial readiness situation and as things are rolling out. And really having a partner with the kind of expertise that we bring from 70+ launches is about increasing transparency and reducing timeline slippage so that everything can get done, and improving collaboration and decision making, ultimately to improve forecast attainment. Pharmaceutical Consulting is a partner that brings insight and informed questions to help uncover risks and interdependencies. We bring a tremendous amount of experience across launches in therapeutic areas to build a comprehensively and appropriately detailed plan and an aggressive launch plan. And then really our goal is to help identify critical decisions and infuse process to accelerate organization decision-making and ultimately the success of the brand. That brings us to the close. We can do some Q&A.
Yes, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. I would like to invite our audience to continue sending their questions or comments right now using the questions window for the Q&A portion of this webinar. I've already received some questions, so we'll get started with those. Our very first question asks, how many digital technologies do you see pharma companies implementing to overcome the lockout of field staff from doctors' offices? And further, what kind are these technologies being implemented more for commercial sales staff or MSLs?
That's a great question with what's going on right now, because it is a completely different environment, and our teams and our client organizations had to really just spin on a dime and think about how do you close safely for your internal organization, and then how do you re-engage. What we've seen in the marketplace is that relationships really matter, that having an established relationship, whether that was a sales field force, an educator field force, or even the medical liaisons, they were the most able to get communication lines open again through email, through phone, and ultimately it's starting a bit live, and even click-through on emails was improved when there was a relationship established. So that's definitely critical. And then the ability to really be responsive to customers, because they are all opening and dealing with the same kinds of issues around security and their own organization needs. So you have to be able to be very customer focused as to what they're ready for and what their needs are, and when to open up those communications live again, or how to keep going and engaging digitally.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question would like to know, how do you find that brand counsel plays a vital role in helping to shape launch strategy, especially in the risk mitigation planning around major tipping points? And how do you typically find yourself interacting with legal stakeholders?
Yeah, so I can talk about brand counsel to a certain extent. So I think brand counsel, in my experience, is more of an external body of KOLs and payers that are providing important feedback on brand development decisions. And typically what we like to do is actually bring that sort of key information, key decisions to the brand counsel for input along the way, and have that start fairly early in development, so that you're reacting to clinical trial design decisions, for example. You're having them react to value proposition suggestions or elements of value. And I think the more you can include that insight in your thinking, the better off you'll be, particularly when you're looking at what is the standard of care in a target line of therapy, and does the asset that you're developing provide incremental value, and then over what time frame will the stakeholder expect to see that value. So I think the brand counsel can be extremely effective. As to the legal environment, this is actually a good question, I think, because in some organizations, there needs to be some education of the legal team around the population that you're going after, and what the sort of standard of care is, just so they understand what the brand team is up against. So I think engaging them in those early conversations and how you plan to engage your stakeholders is a pretty important thing.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that with legal, because from a marketing perspective, if you really want to be innovative and try and be cutting edge in your marketplace, it can often be a challenge with regard to the compliance and legal team being on the same page. Yeah. And so we do a lot of analogs where we demonstrate what's going on in the marketplace and what risks, perceived risks may not be true risks if you can show someone else has done it already or someone else has done something similar. And so a lot of analogs can help with that process.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Our next question would simply like to know, are launch risks different across therapeutic areas?
That's a great question. And, you know, there are probably some that are consistent across brands and therapeutic areas. You always have regulatory levels of risk and manufacturing levels of risk. I think the challenges in the risk areas, as you think across therapeutic areas, is what does the competitive environment look like? How hard is it in some of these rare diseases to get physician attention or at the right time? How hard is it to find the patient or even increase diagnosis? So I definitely think from a commercial risk perspective, those things change as you're going across therapeutic areas. And in the oncology space, there's aspects of the supply and the process of patient support that become more challenging areas because of the nature of oncology.
And I would just add to that, Beth, that I think that the launch risks are not only product specific or disease specific, but they're also organizationally specific, because each organization comes with its own set of strengths and weaknesses and collaboration opportunities. And so the risks that one company in a target disease area might have will be different than another organization, just because there are different people involved, different infrastructures created, and different needs to support the launch.
I think that's a really good point.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Our next question asks, how far in advance should a detailed launch plan be developed?
That is a great question. We get that all the time. Like I said, we did it as quick as 3 months. I think we've actually done it as quick as 6 weeks for one small product. I think the optimal time for a detailed launch plan is really 2 years. I think a more general launch plan is 3 years, because it needs to inform your resource planning. And so it needs to be done in enough time for budget planning and in enough time for the right level of market shaping with the HCPs, patients, and payers. And that takes really 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, I mean, the purpose of doing that planning is really not only to get your organization sort of lined up, but also to identify your risk areas. And if you're planning earlier, you're doing the work to say, where are our launch risk areas going to be? And if you do it early enough, you can actually mitigate those. The closer you do it to launch, obviously, the tougher it is to mitigate those risks. But that's why we would recommend a sort of a general plan at least 3 years ahead, and then starting to get more detailed at 2 years, and certainly very finely detailed at 12 months.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Our next question asks, what are best practices in launch management dashboarding?
There's that Goldilocks slide again. It's a good question. I think the best practice is ensuring that you are dashboarding monthly, and that allows you a view into each swim lane of functional area, and that your culture allows for real, clear, transparent discussions, that everything isn't always green, that you're getting detailed enough to see where things are a challenge area. And you're also using the whole organization. While everyone has functional expertise, a lot of times there are challenges that can be best met by your whole senior organization thinking around key challenges and making sure that the dashboarding is bringing that up as well.
Well, thank you very much for that answer and for all of the answers. However, we have reached the end of the question and answer portion of the webinar. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Pharmaceutical Consulting may follow up with you, or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses on your screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. And a survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in the chat box, and with this link, you can view the recorded archive for this event on this page, and you can share this with your colleagues when they register for the recording there as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Beth Sherman and David Reese. We hope that you found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone.
All right.